On the morning of June 29, 1995, Sampoong Department Store, a massive 5-story building in Seoul, South Korea, was on the brink of disaster. Cracks had widened to 10 centimeters, and loud cracking noises echoed throughout the building. But the owner of the department store decided not to close it. He worried about huge revenue loss. Only the executives and board members left the building. They left behind thousands of shoppers and staff. At 5:52 p.m. that day, the building suddenly collapsed, leading to the deaths of 502 people and injuring nearly 1,000 more. This tragedy stands as the largest peacetime disaster in South Korean history, but it wasn't just an accident. It was the result of a series of critical mistakes, negligence during the building's construction, and the greed of a group of people. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Seoul was undergoing a major transformation. South Korea had just become a democratic country in 1987, and the capital city hosted the Summer Olympics in 1988. These events led to a construction boom, with many ambitious projects being quickly approved and built. One such project was the Sampoong Department Store, originally planned as a 4-story residential building by the Sampoong Group in 1987. The project was initially managed by Woosung Construction. However, soon after construction began, Lee Jun, the chairman of the Sampoong Group's construction division, decided to change the building's purpose. Instead of a residential block, it was now going to be an upscale department store. This change came with significant alterations. An extra floor was added, and the number of support columns was reduced to make room for escalators. Woosung Construction expressed concerns about these changes, fearing they would affect the building's structural integrity. When they refused to proceed with the modifications, Lee Jun fired them and hired a more cooperative construction team. To bypass zoning regulations that limited the building's use, Lee Jun initially planned to include a roller skating rink on the newly added 5th floor. Later, he changed his mind and decided the 5th floor should be a food court with underfloor heating. These changes added even more stress to the already compromised support columns. As soon as construction was completed in 1990, problems began to surface. Tenants in nearby buildings complained about the noise from the air conditioning units installed on the roof of the department store. Instead of using cranes to move the heavy machinery, which would have been the proper procedure, workers dragged the units across the roof using rollers and pulleys. This caused cracks to form, which grew over time due to the vibrations from the air conditioning units. By April 1995, these cracks were visible on the ceiling of the 5th floor. Despite this, management only relocated some stores from the top floor to the basement and otherwise ignored the problem. By the morning of the 29th of June, the number and size of the cracks had increased dramatically, but the building was still kept open. Loud cracking noises were heard throughout the building as existing cracks yawned open to as wide as 10 centimeters or 3.9 inches. Worried, management switched off the air conditioning units, closed the worst affected sections of the top floor, and called an emergency board meeting. It was thought at this time that the eventual collapse of the building was inevitable. Chairman Lee Jun was present at the meeting. When the idea of evacuating the entire building was floated, he reacted angrily. It was an unusually busy day, and clearing out the entire department store would lead to a staggering loss of revenue. This argument proved persuasive, and it was decided that a full evacuation would be unnecessary. Instead, only the executives and board members left the building, Lee Jun included. They left behind thousands of shoppers and staff, including Lee Jun's own daughter-in-law, who worked for a store in the building. At 5:52 p.m., the roof gave way. The air conditioning units fell through to the 5th floor, causing it to collapse onto the floors below. The overburdened support columns failed, leading to a complete collapse of the south wing of the building in less than half a minute. This sudden collapse left hundreds of people trapped and injured in the wreckage. Rescue teams quickly arrived at the scene. They evacuated people from the parts of the building that were still standing and transported the injured to hospitals. Small fires, caused by vehicles crushed in the collapse, were extinguished. However, the mayor of Seoul halted the rescue operation shortly after it began, fearing that the remaining structure might collapse and endanger rescuers. Public protests forced the authorities to stabilize the wreckage with cables and resume the rescue efforts. Rescue workers used a special transmitter provided by Korea Telecom to activate the cell phones of people trapped in the rubble, helping them locate survivors. Many people were pulled from the debris, some injured but alive. Despite the official statement after 2 days that there were no more survivors, several people were found alive over the next 2 weeks. They had survived by drinking rainwater that trickled through the wreckage. However, many initial survivors drowned due to the excess water used by firefighters to extinguish small fires. The last survivor, 19-year-old Park Sung-hyun, was rescued after spending 17 days under the rubble, miraculously suffering only minor injuries. The final death toll of the disaster was 502, with 937 people injured. It was the deadliest accidental building collapse ever recorded at that time and remained so for over a decade. An investigation was launched to determine the cause of the collapse. Initial theories included a gas leak or a terrorist attack by North Korea, but these were soon ruled out. The investigation, led by Professor Lan Chung from the Dankook Engineering School, revealed that the collapse was due to structural failure. Tests showed that much of the concrete mix used was substandard, made of cement and seawater, and that some of the steel reinforcing rods were also below standard. Additionally, the support columns had been altered, and the air conditioning units had been dragged across the roof, making the collapse inevitable. Lee Jun was sentenced to 10.5 years in prison for criminal negligence. His son, who had been the CEO of the department store, received a 7-year sentence for accidental homicide and corruption. Several city officials were also imprisoned or fined for accepting bribes to overlook the building's poor condition. Both Lee Jun and his son agreed to surrender their assets to compensate the victims. The Sampoong Group ceased to exist, but the story didn't end there. The disaster prompted extensive inspections of buildings across Seoul, particularly those built during the late 1980s and early 1990s construction boom. Hundreds of buildings were found to be unsafe, with 1 in every 7 requiring significant rebuilding and only 1 in 50 deemed completely safe. The Sampoong Department Store had been built quickly and cheaply, generating significant wealth, but its unstable foundations led to a catastrophic failure. The site of the Sampoong Department Store remained vacant until 2000, when it was redeveloped into the Acrovista apartment complexes. A memorial sculpture for the victims can be found at Yongnye Citizens Forest in Seoul. The Sampoong disaster remains a stark reminder of the dangers of cutting corners and ignoring safety regulations in pursuit of economic growth. It stands as a tragic chapter in South Korea's history, highlighting the importance of integrity and accountability in construction and development.